welcome back to the DXM podcast. I am your host, Colborn, and I am joined today by Katie Payton Hofstadter. Katie, welcome.
Hi, Colborn. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you as well. We start this program in the same place, and that is giving our guests the space to talk about themselves. So anything you would like to share that would provide some context about you?
Sure. I'm a writer, curator, artist, general culture creator, organizer, multi-hyphenate. And some recent projects have included an article I wrote called Bodies on the Blockchain, which was turned into a virtual exhibition called Lifelike, which was expanded into an exhibition presented in a gallery called Vellum, also called Lifelike, which will travel in the fall to a university. So it's taken multiple forms. And I've also co-founded several public art campaigns, especially focusing on artists working with emerging technology. And that's where my interest and focus is right now.
Yeah, amazing. I am super curious, just very broadly interested in what emergent technologies you're excited about, and maybe some of the artists who are exploring these.
Yeah, I feel like there's an equal part excitement and fear. I think when I look at our sort of techno future, I feel a lot of anxiety about where things are going, as well as excitement for, unlocked potential. So there's part of me that thinks where I feel the most anxiety, that's where I want to focus. And I think artists, projects in the past, I've looked at artists who are working with AR, artists who are working with VR. This past project has looked at artists who are minting biological genetic identity material on a digital ledger. And I'm also, of course, very interested in how artists are creating machine learning models that don't look like the popular models that we see, because I feel like we're being asked to enter into a public debate with a really narrow lens on what machine learning is. This sort of basically like, is ChatGPT good or bad? When there are creative people, specifically a lot of the artists I'm talking to, who are presenting other types of systems and models that we could be talking about in a much more, to me, a much more exciting way.
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can even begin to frame this the right way. We have these incredibly emerging technologies. There is also a deep care and concern for, a social aspect to this, access to these technologies, like individual rights to, their own data, sovereignty, right to privacy. And I think there's a common theme of, amidst all of this like rapid accelerationism, the need to kind of slow down and assess and be critical and ask the questions. I don't know what the question is, but how do you even begin to like balance these two?
For me, it's looking for better models. In this past exhibition, I focused really specifically in Lifelike on Bodies on the Blockchain, the article on artists who were using themselves to stress test this new technology. And I think like starting generally and getting more specific, like I'm interested in how we as like artists, writers, multi-hyphenate culture creators are looking at emerging technology and the systems around it and stress testing it with a creative lens. So not following the manual, but following curiosity, creative impulses, own experiences, and sort of mapping the manifolds, like changing the viewing angle and asking where it stops working or starts doing something really weird within this like impossible to imagine hyperdimensional space that potentially bounds these technologies and systems. So when I wrote Bodies in the Blockchain over the summer for Right Click Save, I got to interview a lot of artists about how they were minting biological and genetic material aspects of their bodies. And I realized what they were really doing was probing what the future was going to feel like for our bodies as well as our minds. If you can, separate those, arguably you can't, but we think of it that way. And also how much bigger this question is than we might realize. And I can talk about that article if you like, or am I answering the question?
Yeah. I think like we're presented with this idea of the cybernetic future, right? That we will be increasingly melded with machines, that Elon Musk will have a neural link that just, is capturing and recording all of this data. And at the same time, it seems kind of, far off, although, we carry supercomputers in our pockets and are constantly connected and wired to all of this. But I think that it is generally, for most people, a detriment to their detriment and a burden. And I think we're all simultaneously hoping like for a release from these things. Again, I don't know if there's a question there, but
no, I do think it's so urgent right now to explore how technology is breaching and blurring the boundaries of our bodies, if those boundaries exist. And I think you can say that maybe it's a little naive to say there's a boundary between our physical and digital selves, for example. But I think sometimes it's useful to draw a line in order to talk about it, or to look at where artists are, different artists are drawing that line in order to talk about it. And I am interested in techno-futurist narratives, but so often I feel like they seem to imagine that we might end up being some version of like mental activity floating in identical vats of goo. And I think as our technology, continues to invade the boundaries of our bodies, already very much happening medically. And you mentioned Neuralink and other BCI, brain-computer interfaces. I think as we embrace the power of these new abilities, we can't separate our minds and our bodies, and we can't stop foregrounding the fact that not all bodies are the same, and some identities are empowered or elevated through these systems, while others are systematically targeted or made invisible, subject to violence. And I think a lot of our systems don't acknowledge that. There's this idea of a lot of the artwork in this show actually is, I think about Sammy Wheeler and Mistress Fix's piece, Impressions, where they created a hybrid interactive performance documentation piece that has to do with turning over control over and over and over again. And it was a performance that Sammy designed for Mistress Fix, a dom, to perform upon her in the gallery. She was nearly naked, wearing a mask. She said that she couldn't hear anything or see anything, and it was the most comfortable she'd ever felt in a gallery opening in her life. Everybody sort of, I think, relates to. Yeah. And then after the performance, during the performance, Sammy invited the audience to take crowdsourced documentation, to take cell phone videos. They posted videos to the internet and then sent them to Sammy and Mistress Fix. And it sort of turns over the control yet again. And then Sammy took back control of that documentation and presented it, created masks and created this video that was then presented back in the Vellum show. And so reflecting on how this depth of experience is flattened when it's represented on our screens and
Mm.
measured in impressions, and also drawing attention to the precarity of digital representations for trans people and sex workers. And something that really stands out about it also, I think, is this, coming back to this idea of these technologies we're talking about. We have this default idea of the objective observer, like the gaze, you might say, or like even when you're reading a piece that is written in third person, there's an idea of who this objective authority is. And we don't necessarily think about what the identity of that authority is, but it really is. It's not trans. It's not a sex worker. It's probably not female or non-binary. Like it, when we talk about the white male gaze, I think it extends into the way that we, look at who is the author of a text, or who is in control of a technology system. Who is it made for? I feel like I've gotten far away from the question.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's asking a whole lot of other questions that I'd like to dig into, but I'd love to let you finish if.
I think the point I was coming back to is, like, we know that technology is not neutral, but I don't know that we always think about all of the different things that means, like how deeply those fingers extend into every part of our experience, that non-neutrality.
And I think the scary thing as these emergent technologies continue is how much deeper into ourselves they will continue to go. We know the biases that exist within the data sets that are, that is used to train and generate AI. And, everything from the design of a VR headset, right, to, well, I think it really just extends everywhere. And I think technology, for the most part, despite preaching more of like an egalitarian narrative, is actually very, very centralizing. And like control of processing power would predominantly skew, again, just like white male. So I feel this tension that I think you feel as well, of like runaway systems that are out of control that need some sort of pause, like repositioning, recomposing. But I am, a bit scared that they're like runaway trains.
An artist that I love to talk about in this context is Lauren Lee McCarthy, who created this series that began during the pandemic, where she's looking at digital intimacy and thinking about what it feels like to want to just seek physical contact, physical proximity with the people you care about, but at the same time to know that that proximity could actually put them in danger, and using technology to explore the idea of intimacy without putting expectations on what's going to happen. She had 2 pieces in the Lifelike show, and she actually had a piece in the Lifelike show at Epoch, and then when we brought the show to Vellum, she developed a new piece. There's a total of, I think, 3-4 pieces. Sorry, I'm getting the number wrong. There are 3 in the Epoch show, and then she developed a new one for Vellum, so there's a total of 4. And one of them is called Sleepover, and during the pandemic, she would go to her friends' houses and, in her words, gift them her physical body. She would go and sleep on their lawn, and they would only communicate by text. And so there was physical proximity, but all of the communication was mediated through technology. And for the Vellum show, she turned it into an NFT that could be purchased by a collector who would sort of basically like enter into her practice as a patron and have this experience, that she's created. And something I thought that just blew me away was each time this piece sells, she'll do the performance again. And to me, that just speaks to like how deeply she's committed to having taking this experience as far as it will go and like learning everything she can from it. And the other piece was called Good Morning, and it was a counterpart to a piece called Good Night, where every night before she goes to bed, she texts the owner of Good Night. For morning, the owner of the piece has to open it and say good morning to it every day. And if they don't open the piece every day and greet it, then it dies. And the concept was so simple, but when people started, I feel like collecting is such a cliche word for this. When people started like bringing this into their lives, it was amazing to watch how they were responding. Like Operator in Berlin, they were like, we are devising a device to keep this alive for generations. And then, another collector was like, my main, digital relationship, my first digital relationship was with Twitter. Every morning I open up Twitter and I'm going to like change my habit to open this piece, which is very beautiful, first in the morning. And then I'll open Twitter, and trying to come up with a technology to keep it, if they're offline for a day, for some reason, how to, keep it being visited and cared for. And then it maybe like one of my favorite reactions was Dina Chang said, I have too much stuff in my life. And I think we can all relate to that. And it's not just physical stuff, it's digital stuff. And I actually want to have a relationship to everything that is under my like stewardship, basically. And like this to me reminds me of like that the things that, the things in my life I should care about them. Or maybe it's something that I shouldn't own at all. So I am really intrigued by Lauren's work because I do feel like she's playing with creating different systems that involve our like mediated experiences with each other through technology. And I think it just shows how if we're looking at what artists like her are creating, we can expand our idea of our techno future beyond just like, is anything beyond GPT-4 good or bad? Yes or no? Like,
right, sure. I think this is definitely some things in there that I've been trying to reconcile with. I think the digital invites so much abundance, the idea or, potential for meaningful connections, for digital intimacy. But I think to your point, I've really struggled with like, what are the things that I actually can't keep and put under my stewardship? And it just feels like when everything is moving so quickly, you just, you never have the time. You never have the time to like recognize and curate and actually like bring your attention and appreciation to these things that you already have. And yeah, just in all of this work that I've collected, seeing all these things, but like,
yeah,
just stopping and pausing, and it's hard. It's hard because the artists are so good too,
yeah.
they create so much. There's so many. I just feel like this space is continuing to unlock and inspire creatively so many talented people with so much to like share and give. It's really quite special.
I agree. We spoke before the podcast about how to describe, communities become a dirty word. But like how to describe, is it post media? I want to credit a conversation with Charlotte Kent for suggesting that word, which I do like. What do we call the community that's doing this work? And it does feel like there is a different sort of support system. Like there this is not really my focus, but I do like that I can register my patronage with an artist whose work I like for a couple of bucks, just sort of like officially, beyond going on a studio visit and saying, I love your work. And maybe it eventually leads to a text or something, but I can also like, I've been interviewing artists for like around 10 years. And I feel like at the end of every interview, this just sort of happened, but I would always end up asking artists, like, what do you want in the future? Like, what sort of art world do you want to be in, or literary world? Like, what, if you could control it, what would it look like? And they have lots of answers, but in that answer is almost always some version of, I would love to work more collaboratively. I want to work more in community. It's this is often a lonely exploration. And I think that there's a lot of benefits to that, like to working alone. But then I also helped design a project for Apex Art a while ago. It was a high school program, and we had talked about sending me into high schools to talk about opportunities in the art world. And I'll just be like really honest. I was like, I would not be allowed in the door if I told you what my real experience is. It's like, it's bad. Like, this, like their parents would need to sign a consent form. Like,
for the truth. Yeah.
That's just being very honest. And so I was like, I don't want to, I think their concerns are valid. And for me to come in and say, you all have these opportunities feels wrong. Like, I would rather, and so I worked with Stephen. We sort of developed this idea where we would go in and we would ask them what they wanted. Like, what if they, we did mind maps and exercises, and they answered questions, and then eventually leading to them sort of saying, what sort of world do you want to go into? And the idea was we would like catalog all these models, and I found the same thing. Like, they had lots of ideas about, really great ideas about the world they wanted to enter, but there was always the like through line was like some element where they wanted to be in community and work collaboratively. And I don't totally know where I'm going with this, except that I think something about Web3 has like picked up on that, but in a really twisted way. But I also think, like, I really feel this in Los Angeles, like, there is this impulse to I don't know, there is this impulse of support and being interested in helping each other, and archiving maybe a discipline that's very hard to archive, that could easily be lost if you don't have the right operating systems, or if a project isn't written up, a couple operating systems later, it's lost forever. And it does feel like something special is happening around that I'm like, I haven't felt before. And it feels good to be a part of that. And I also feel wary that it's tied up in these like commercial ideas of community that are being promoted by
yeah. I mean, it's so much of like a reflective mirror, right? Like, whatever you kind of wish to see is pretty much what you will see.
The Rorschach test.
Yeah. I mean, crypto from the beginning has always been a great way to incentivize and bootstrap communities, collective communities, generally around kind of ideas. Now, most of these are rather flash in the pan or lean substantially marketing over substance. It's been nice to begin to attach like visual identity, especially like the identity of an artist to the token, because that unlike most of these, financial games that are being played, is something that is more, I think, trusted, and people take, their credit, their persona, they lay it out on the line, their reputation. And, there's something much more genuine about that, and how like that humans' values relate to like value is another like interesting question, and how these things get valued. But again, it's a very, weird and wild and speculative thing to begin to even play in this arena.
It's interesting, like the word speculation, like I've had so many associations with speculative, with like speculative futures, like Christiane Paul exhibition at the New School, 10 years ago. And of course, like this is tied with speculation is also, has its applications in finance. And I know that art and money are inextricably tied. But I think I do feel a lot more comfortable talking about the artist's projects, because I think a lot of what I've been working with, speaking specifically about the most recent project with Lifelike, I think the artists are using blockchain as a digital ledger, as a way of talking about, surveillance. Our, phones harvest information about our bodies and behaviors by default. Our, every swipe movement and like private message is under surveillance, and the idea of logging things on a digital ledger like functions symbolically in that way. I don't feel like this needs to be tied to crypto, but at the same time, I do understand that art is, we live in like, in extractive capitalism, like everything is taking place in this capitalist system. Artists need to survive. Artists need to make money. If tying art to a currency is helping artists survive and be able to, make a living, then that's what exists. But I do have a hard time feeling loyalty to any, particular monetary system, especially knowing that, just like fiat, the majority of the holders of crypto are a very small number of people, and that like sinking feeling that that like the art and culture side is also being used to bolster the value of those major holders. So there's a bit of a devil's bargain in that.
There is.
I don't know. How do you feel?
I mean, look, I come from a finance background, right? And I understand, because of this, again, it is extractive capitalism. Extractive capitalism rules the world. But, and then it's like, it's almost to the point where it's inescapable, right? So the proposal of new models, new systems, like the thing, we can either like accelerate through to the point where it gets so bad that it has to collapse, or we can build parallel architectures. And I'm all for, personally, the idea of building parallel architectures so that people have places to go when inevitably the thing does collapse. Because I truly believe the system that we have is completely and inherently unsustainable. And I generally consider capital to, people talk about free-flowing capital. I believe capital to be cement. I believe it like enshrines and ingrains and holds institutions and structures in place and gives them rigidity that doesn't allow anything to change. And I believe that like the basis of the currency holds all the values. So, like 80% of international trade is settled in US dollars. So we have to like look what are the actual values of the US government, and how are we complicit in supporting those values by like earning and spending and, supporting that system. So a lot of looking at those values didn't align with my values. And I think, it got closer with cryptocurrency, but it's not perfect. So
I think if I can give a couple of examples that come to mind, like mentioned earlier that I'd worked on a couple of public art campaigns, and one was the Climate Clock Monument
Right.
in Union Square, and we basically the idea was, we didn't realize this in the beginning, but it was really to remonument time and how we think about time, and to replace a counter sort of like solar Gregorian calendar, very human oriented calendar, to call it planetary time. Like, this is the amount of time we have left, to act in time on the climate crisis, before we've locked in 1.5 degrees Celsius, like centigrade, which unfortunately I think we're there. But and I should mention, we worked with the artists who created the metronome, which is Kristen Jones and Andrew Gonzell.
Mm.
The next project I worked on was the Aurora Network, formerly Make Us Visible, and we were inviting artists to create this network that would use AR to place new, diverse, and gender expansive monuments in public spaces and juxtapose them to statues of mostly white men. And I think, for both of these projects, who and what is honored in our public spaces, with swords or on 70-foot pedestals or 10 stories high over Union Square, it sends a message to all of us about what we value as a culture, and that has power. So I do think it's possible as artists and culture workers to try to imagine these systems, even though sometimes it feels like such small progress. And I also want to mention what a long tradition there is of artists working in AR to do this. I think AR specifically has really been powerfully used. I think about Tommy Teal and Will Poppenheimer and Manifest AR. This is not a new idea that we can use AR to create prefigure a different kind of space. And I can name two examples from the Lifelike exhibition, two artists that I think are looking at two different sides of one new idea. Because you mentioned Neuralink, and brain-computer interfaces are something I've been thinking a lot about. For Bodies on the Blockchain, I interviewed Lance King, who had created a dashboard that basically tracked all of his vital signs. It basically showed that he was alive, if he was awake or asleep, if he was nervous, if he was, sped up or slowed down, or to create this, he basically used every tracker a human can place on their body, like he placed on his body, including implanting an NFC chip in the soft tissue of his left hand. And also committed to, he's like, if something new comes out, I will, I will use it. I will put it on my body. I will apply it. It will go into this network. For Lifelike, he was also experimenting with these prototype brain-machine interface helmets that were tracking his mental activity and taking that activity and turning it, using an algorithm to turn it into a sculpture. And it took me some time to process this, because I was stuck on the idea that, what is it? Is it reading your mind? Is it saying what you're thinking? Is it? I didn't immediately understand the gravity, I guess, of just taking control of your own mental data and creativity. And there's, at the same time, there's this long tradition of artists creating visualizations of creativity. And then also this idea of saying, this is my information. I have trouble with the word data. We can talk about that if you want to, but my information about my experience, and I'm using it as an artist. And if someone wants to make the argument to take it, I need to hear what that argument is. So it's sort of taking away the idea that by default, all of our experience is just scrapable. At the same time, there's also an artist, Edgar Fabian Frias, who created a piece called Kika. And it was looking at a different way of looking at our mental data. And the piece that Edgar created was a Neureka, which is it's a sort of map, and this comes from Edgar comes from the We Are Beacon community, and these maps help us. They're sort of divining tools that help us locate ourselves in both like physical and spiritual reality. Um, and Kika translates to come closer or cuddle up. And it's a combination between like these very modern ideas of like glitch aesthetics and internet subcultures and abstract art incorporated into this map that you can stand in front of and have an experience where you're locating yourself in space and time and spiritually. And it's an experience I can't describe. It's very beautiful to sort of meditate with this piece, and it also draws attention to the difference between, back to this idea of data, because if you're wearing an interface that creates lines and numbers and this list of something called data, I think our DNA is the same way. This is suddenly scientific. And if you're talking about other traditions, it may be like meaningful transcendental experiences where you can absolutely see the effect of these experiences, but it's not lines and numbers and translated as data, then it gets treated very differently, and it isn't taken as seriously, or it's exoticized, or it's marginalized. And it's, to me, it's just another way of showing like we do have other ways of looking at, incorporating other knowledge into different types of systems. It doesn't have to be, is it ChatGPT or nothing?
Like the almost the magic of the unobservable, what it means to like have sensations and feelings that don't come down to actual like recorded science. How do we begin to even like address and assess what it means to like be human and have these experiences? And I think that goes back to, again, like a lot of the reason things are structured, by this group or these institutions have these biases, is because it is just, from like power and violence, and a history of all of this. So how do we begin to like get to the other side of that as humans, and find kind of more of the things that like relate and connect? And I don't know, I wonder if technology is like leading us there, or if it isn't.
Yeah, I like, my best response is like, this is what brings me to be interested in how artists are looking at that. And
Right.
I keep going back, like Carla Gannis. I just remember like many years ago, we had this like very like germinal conversation where she was just talking about kicking the tires and looking under the hood. And I've just never forgotten that idea. And I think it goes even beyond that with like stress testing, what these technologies will feel like. And in this past project, I just felt like I was tired of like theoretical discussions. And I just thought it was so brave to talk to artists who were sort of just stress testing this on themselves.
Yeah.
And I should mention that this came out of conversations with my editor, Alex Estruck at Right Click Save, and began with this commission, which is really, once I started talking to artists about this, it was like I couldn't stop. I can, thinking about how, what you were mentioning about these systems, it's like I can name 2 more artists that I think of when you say that, which, Una and Laurie Baldwin. Like what Una was doing, there's a video in the gallery, and it's ostensibly about how, the distribution of money. She's using Super Rare as the index, but between male artists and then female artists, non-binary artists, and trans artists. And it's like it's really very shocking.
Yeah,
I guess
that piece spread is really incredible. Yeah.
And on a larger sense, what she's also doing is like the creation of this character of Una, which is pseudonymous artist. It's also part of the piece. Like Una is embodying this like collision between supposedly progressive technologies that we were talking about in the beginning and like regressive ideas about gender. And you could, expand this to other conversations. I like at the same time, there's also Castles, who's created the character of white male artist.
Right.
To, I love Castle's research process because it's so absurd that you're sort of like laughing through tears. It's like bringing humor to like systemic oppression, and it's just people are probably familiar with the project, but for a month they'd researched the top grossing artists at auction, and in a sort of like twist on the Manzoni piece, where Manzoni sold off his own shit. Castles ate the same diet as these top grossing artists with the idea, if I eat the same shit they ate, can I make the same shit they made? And as a transmasculine artist, Castles created this character, white male artist, and sold the work through that pseudonym, through Phillips and Snark. And they ate that diet every day and produced a can of shit every day. And those cans of shit exist. They have like little velvet, display, very nice, little, beautiful pedestals. And so since the reveal that the artist is actually Castles, there's sort of an additional layer of humor that I had a piece for Lifelike, which was called Special Shit, and it was a compilation of the entire project, and it was exceedingly special and rare because it was from white male artist's personal collection, so very highly valued.
Right.
And white male artists had valued the piece at $1 billion. And it's definitely, I think, the highest price, work like I've ever been around. So that was, the aura of that was very special.
I love that. Yeah, what I've realized is I don't have any sort of like linguistic or mental framework for this conversation, right? I felt myself kind of struggling through it all, and I think you've been so helpful in just like bringing me back to the arts to like just ground it, and I think that's obviously the like the point of good art, right? Is to not necessarily give the answer, but just to state the question again and again. And yeah, I'm always somebody trying to like grasp for the answer. The answer doesn't exist. I don't even have the framework really to talk about it, but what we should be talking about is the art that probes the questions.
Yeah, Claudia Rankine actually pointed out this like genealogy of like quotations, if you say, like, I think Dostoevsky wrote, "We have all the answers. It's the questions we don't know." And then James Baldwin, of course, like put it even better by saying, he wrote, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions hidden by the answers." And I feel like, I just like moderated this talk with Rafik Anadol and Parag Mittal at Deitch, and surrounded by this Rafik Anadol exhibition, it was like, that is what I felt like. We know all the answers, is the questions we don't know. Like this is where we find the questions. And I think the questions are important because that helps us frame public discourse. It's not like, I don't think it's, I don't think it has to stay in like an elite art. Very easy for me to want to go into like a theoretical flight of fancy about how I think about all of these things. But like you're saying, I think by looking at these concrete examples of like how artists in their practices really are thinking about, this it's not a game. Like it's not,
Right.
It's, I love all kinds of art. I love painting. I love drawing. I used to love to draw. Like sometimes I like making pretty things, but I think this work is so urgent because if you spend time with it, I do think something that happens is like something inside of you pushes back against it. Like you have a response of, if it's disgust or, revulsion or excitement. I mean, I think that's really where it is. Like that response you're having to work like this is exactly where the, not to be not to be cliche, but like that's where the art is. That's what's happening.
Right.
And I like to encourage people to just like spend enough time with it to like feel something push back. And I think with all good art, that's been my experience.
Yeah, and I had this.
Good's a bad word. Like, meaningful art.
I had this great master plan to turn, your question that you ask everybody against you, which what is the art world that you want to see, if I remember correctly. But I think in this interview you've answered it. So unless you have a hot take on that, that'll be the last thing before we say goodbye.
I do think I'm seeing like the way people, I think there's an urgency to these issues that people are rallying around that is what I want to see. Right. So it's there. There's one piece I didn't mention, and so I don't know if I should or if this is a good place to end. It's up to you.
Well, let's talk about it.
Okay.
I don't want to leave that one poor person out.
It feels so, it's like we ended and then I'm like, please, one more thing I have to tell you. You have to know about this.
Yeah.
In these When We Were All Flowers, and it has to do with DNA. And when I wrote the article, I interviewed Rachel Rawson, who had minted her DNA, and she'd minted it as a text file, the sequence DNA. And there was a power to that. And all the obvious implications of the fact that we do sell our, genetic information every day, and how invasive that is, and what does it feel like to just literally look at what that is. And she priced it at $1 million. It wasn't meant to sell. It was meant to be, a statement about how our, how invasive technology was in our bodies. And when I curated Lifelike, Jin Liu was another artist who was working in like a very, very, very similar vein, and she had printed her DNA, and she created this piece called When We Were All Flowers, where she took that sequence DNA and she turned it, she sort of coded the AAGGTTCC, with shapes and colors to create this beautiful, like morphing shape that is like both a flower and a root system. And in the virtual exhibition, we were like, where do you want it in the biosphere? And she was like, oh, I want it in the desert. Like, talking to her recently, she's like, I think water is life. And, the implications of that, freezing water is freezing life. And she's, working with the SETI Institute and talking about what's happening in Antarctica. But the reason this piece was so powerful, there's a lot of reasons it's powerful to me, but one of them is, I just think about how, first of all, just the fact that we can get that information about our DNA, about like this information about ourselves. It's really so remarkable. I mean, it's a fucking miracle. And I think she's turned it into this like beautiful, wild visualization of resilience that like kind of captures the awe that we have this information. And I do think there's something about maintaining that, like, it's almost like it feels like it's almost, I don't want to be like religious and call it holy, but it's like, this is really sacred information. And what are we doing with it? And I love that piece as a sort of like figurehead for that. Like, really, I don't know if that's a conclusion, but yeah.
Thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. My mind is going to absolutely be racing. I would love for you to just let people know where they can find more about you, your writing, any socials you'd like to share.
Yeah, sure. My website is allnightbookstore.com, and Katie _ Peyton _ on Instagram, and the very dorky Hofstadter Katie on Twitter. And this exhibition will travel from LA up to Cal Poly in the fall of next year, where it began as a virtual exhibition, then became a screen-based exhibition in Vellum with the interactive exhibition there as well. And then at Cal Poly, it's going to be we have more transmedia capabilities, so the artists will have the ability to sort of choose how they, with this very conceptual work, a lot of the pieces can exist in multiple formats, and so they'll have the opportunity, if they want, to expand how these pieces look, and that process is actually really exciting to me. So I'm looking forward to sharing more about that.
Super. I guess we'll say goodbye here. I want to thank you, Katie Payton Hofstadter, our guest, DMINTI for putting us together. I'm Colborn Bell, and we will see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Breaking news.